Today is June 12th, 2024, and this marks the 30-year anniversary of the night that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered in Los Angeles, in Brentwood, and what kicked off the O.J. Simpson trial. So I want to sort of honor their passing in a way, while at the same time discussing OJ Made in America, the documentary from ESPN. Now, the reason why I'm reviewing it on this day is because it is the anniversary of the murders and because OJ Simpson died earlier this year. OJ Simpson was a very controversial figure. Now, when the murders first took place and the trial of the century happened back in the 90s, 94, 95, 96, I was a kid. I was a little kid. I didn't really care that much because I didn't really understand what was going on. I did not know O.J. Simpson from the celebrity that he had in the NFL because he played football before I was born. I never saw any footage of O.J. Simpson at all on the football field when I was a kid. He just wasn't around. Whereas I knew O.J. Simpson from the Naked Gun movies. My parents loved the Naked Gun movies, and I remember seeing him there as one of the actors in that movie. All of a sudden, these murders take place. He's the one that was basically the number one suspect, and the trial of the century happened. Now, back in 2019, I did a deep dive into O.J. Simpson because, again, I was a little kid when all this happened. I didn't understand it. And I don't really remember what inspired me to go back into OJ, but I know that this year, when he passed away, there was a renewed interest in OJ, specifically the whole story. And so what I did is I went back and I not only watched American Crime Story, The People vs. O.J. Simpson, and I rewatched the 25-part OJ 25 Court TV documentary series, but I watched OJ Made in America, which is what we're talking about today. This documentary was sold to me as being one of the greatest, if not the greatest, sports documentaries ever made. Now, I love me some sports documentaries. I really do. I feel like the best one ever made was probably the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls documentary, The Last Dance. That was just, I was hooked into that. And that's a true sports documentary. This documentary, however, goes far beyond it being a sports documentary and goes into what was really going on, not just in the 90s during the trial and during the murders, but the 80s, the 70s, and really takes a good, hard look, not at OJ's football career, although we'll talk about that here in a minute, but literally it's like his life story and the rise and fall of a man who was considered a hero. He was worshipped even before Michael Jordan was the guy on the Wheaties box and, put his name on everything. O.J. Simpson was one of the first, if not the first, African Americans to cross over into the mainstream when it comes to being somebody that you'd see in the commercials, you'd see making movies. He was a huge star. He was one of the most famous athletes of the 70s, 80s, and of course the 90s. But for people like me who were kids in the 90s, we just know him from the murder trial. And of course, this documentary covers all of that. Now, I went into this already having some knowledge of the O.J. Simpson story, but I want to give a lot of credit to director and producer Ezra Edelman because he really managed to put the whole story together with great editing and great storytelling to where this documentary is captivating. It's 5 parts, and each part is an hour and a half, and it comes out to about 7.5 hours. And the thing about this documentary series is you get a lot more than just anything involving football or anything involving the murders. You get everything. The first part of the documentary, part 1, is really a solid sports documentary. It covers OJ's time playing for the University of Southern California and then, of course, eventually becoming a Buffalo Bill, and covers pretty much his whole career. And part 1 ends with OJ's first introduction to Nicole. And then as the documentary goes on, it begins to focus on not just the life of OJ. And this was also covered in part one, but it really gets hammered home in the subsequent parts, talking about the problems being black and living in Los Angeles, a place where racist police officers would oftentimes abuse physically and emotionally black people in Los Angeles. They would plant evidence, they would arrest them, they would beat them. There was a lot of racial issues for decades in Los Angeles and really all over the country, but LA specifically is what the focus was on, because not only was OJ from LA, but there's a lot of backstory, and the documentary does a great job at introducing, for people who didn't live it, who don't know about it, the civil rights issues that existed in LA. They even go deep into the Rodney King beating and other just complete and utter disgusting and disgraceful things that happened in Los Angeles to innocent black people. It does cover the riots, both the Watts riots and the riots we got later on after the Rodney King acquittal happened, when the cops were acquitted of beating the man. And it really does take a tremendous focus on that story being the reason as to why O.J. Simpson was acquitted. So they interview a lot of people for this thing, including O.J. Simpson's best friend from childhood, including Marsha Clark, the lead prosecutor. They interview some of O.J.'s defense team. Carl Douglas appears, Barry Scheck appears, F. Lee Bailey appears. Johnny Cochran would have probably appeared, but he died before the documentary was made. He died back in 2005, I believe, and so did Kardashian, Robert Kardashian. And Robert Shapiro, the other lead attorney for OJ, has done his best to kind of avoid talking about this. There's interviews about him where he has just not talked about it. But Edelman did a phenomenal job in not only finding the players during the trial. Mark Furman is on this, but he also found a couple of jurors. And the jurors, the people who were on the jury, explain as best they can why they acquitted O.J. Simpson, despite there being overwhelming evidence, despite there being tons of DNA, hair follicles, there was blood. Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman's blood was found on OJ's property, on his glove. And there's all this evidence. There's a motive and everything, but yet that reasonable doubt was created by OJ's defense team, because the reality is, folks, that even though there was a lot of evidence, there was a lot of mistakes made by the criminologists and the LAPD when it comes to gathering the evidence. And as a result of the evidence being tampered with and the DNA being not up to par the way it should be, that was enough to create a reasonable doubt. On top of the fact that Mark Furman, the detective that found the glove, was also a racist, a known racist, and lied on the stand and committed perjury. If you're a jury member and you are African American, most of the jury was African American. That means that you probably either at one point have been abused by a cop, have seen somebody get abused by a cop, or knew somebody who had it happen to them. That's how often it happened. So you've got a jury that already from the get-go does not trust the LAPD. So OJ's dream team of lawyers were able to create that doubt to where, even though the evidence in the criminal trial was in theory enough to put him away, that distrust of the police that had been built up for years and years and years and years and years, I completely understand why the jury made that decision, even though some of the comments made on here by jurors are pretty controversial, because the reality is that most people believe that O.J. Simpson committed these murders, and the evidence is there. And when it came to me, as far as my opinion goes, I didn't really know what to believe. The evidence pointed to OJ being the killer, but there's lots of different theories. However, For me, what really cemented it was the If I Did It book and the OJ confession that he had on Fox. You can actually find the entire thing on YouTube. It was to promote the If I Did It book, and OJ Simpson goes over this quote unquote hypothetical of how the murders may have happened hypothetically. But yet, in his hypothetical description, he refers to himself as I, and the questions being asked of him, he answers, and there are questions that only somebody who was there that night could answer. Now, I'm not going to go into this video going into the different theories because there are about 3 or 4 solid theories about how this happened, whether it be if OJ had an accomplice, or there's rumors about his son. You know, there's a whole bunch of videos about his son maybe being the guilty one. But personally, for me, I do think he's the one who did it based on that interview and all the evidence. However, it does seem likely that the cops may have known deep down that he was guilty and wanted to kind of add more evidence to the pile. So I would not be surprised if there was some police, shadiness. I'm just being very objective here. Like, there was, to me, enough questions. There was enough questionable acts by the cops to where you could say, okay, this doesn't look to be on the level. But again, this is coming from a jury who had lived through the Rodney King beatings, who had lived through the shooting of a 17-year-old girl in the back of the head. The person who shot him, this Korean, ended up getting, didn't even get jail time. It was just insane what the African Americans dealt with in that time period. And in many ways, even though I think racism in this country has gotten better, because my generation and some of the younger Gen Z people, they're not as racist as our great grandparents were. It's just people are becoming a lot more, a lot less racist, I would say. But the reality is racism does still exist. I don't know if the LAPD is totally clean now. I would assume they're not. But you could understand why these African Americans had been through so much crap. This was almost like their payback. Unfortunately, an alleged killer got off. But the documentary does go further into OJ's life, because it also discusses the civil trial as well as discusses the situation OJ got into in the 2000s when he tried to rob back his own merchandise in Las Vegas. That's covered in the 5th and final part of the documentary. So it does kind of go through these various different events in OJ Simpson's life. And I think the reason why it's called Made in America is because O.J. Simpson himself was a made man in America. He crossed over into white America. Everybody loved O.J. Simpson for a decade or more. Maybe 2 decades they loved him. But once this murder, once the murders happened and then the trial happened and all the evidence got put out there, O.J.'s fame just completely was left in shambles. His whole life was left in shambles. And what's crazy about the O.J. Simpson story is that there are so many people who suffered because of it. Not just some of the lawyers. I mean, some of the lawyers got famous, but some of the lawyers had some really tough issues to deal with when it came to being called names from the other side, being accused of being involved in the murder or helping a murderer get off. There's a lot of little aspects of this trial that wound up affecting a lot of people and was a reflection on the racial divide in America. So that's what that means as well, that this whole story is an American story. Other countries who aren't quite the same, who don't have quite the same melting pot aspects, or maybe have different laws or different rules, it might not work out the same way as it did here. It's something that could have only happened in the early 90s and to O.J. Simpson. I don't know if we're ever going to get a story like this again. I think in the future we'll probably have more athletes that are felons and we'll have more situations like this, but there will never be another O.J. Simpson, because it was a time in the history of this country, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when things happened before the internet, before social media, before any of that. the media, like the documentary goes into all that stuff, how putting cameras in the courtroom affected the overall perspective. There's a lot covered here. I will warn you that there are some graphic images in this documentary, specifically in part 4. They, at one time, without even warning you, showed Nicole Simpson's sliced open neck where she was almost decapitated, and they show the body injuries to Ron Goldman. This is stuff that was not available for a long time because it was only shown to the jury in the civil trial, the criminal trial, as well as obviously the attorneys and people like that. And it's on the documentary. And there is a warning at the beginning of that part, but there's no warning right before they actually show it. And I will tell you that that imagery of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman's corpses being sliced open, that's going to stay in my head for a long time, man. That's going to burn into my skull. So please be aware of that. But the documentary had wonderful editing. The story was well told. I do feel like there are other documentaries that cover different aspects of his life more detailed. For example, there's a documentary, it's about an hour long, that covers just the civil trial. Court TV has the 25-part documentary about the criminal trial, as well as there are documentaries out there about just OJ and Nicole's crazy relationship. And this shows all that stuff, man. It shows how he was an abuser, he was a batterer. You know, he battered his wife. I mean, it's almost horrific because she knew she was going to die. She knew that she was going to die. And it's just an absolute tragedy. And it's a story that I think now that O.J. Simpson is dead, people are going to look into again, once again. And just a horrific, horrific murder that spun this entire country. I mean, when O.J. did the low-speed chase in the Bronco where he was being chased by cops, the viewership was estimated to be 95 million people. Think about how insane it is that 95 million people were watching that at the same time. It is a moment in history. So if you like sports documentaries, political documentaries, historical documentaries, or crime documentaries, this is all of that combined. This is crime, sports, politics, civil rights. Everything you could think of is crammed into these 5 parts, but it all makes sense and tells the story of this guy, O.J. Simpson, who, in many ways, this man was not... He wasn't one of those guys that even cared that much about representing his own blackness. That's discussed in the documentary. He was not like a civil rights guy. He hung out with a lot of white people when he made it. He was almost seen as a sellout, but because he was so beloved, nobody really thought of him that way. And OJ himself has talked about how he doesn't really see color. You know, he once said, "I'm not black, I'm O.J. Simpson," you know, and I understand that. I actually, in a weird way, that's somewhat admirable because I do think the way racism is going to end is that we stop seeing each other for color and see each other for who we are as people. And O.J., at least he had that going for him, at least that. But it does talk about the absolute irony that O.J. Simpson never really cared that much about being black. You understand what I'm saying? Until the time came for his defense team to use the fact that he's African American to help him get off and be acquitted of the murder. It's really one of history's great ironies and a crazy story. So it's on ESPN Plus. It's called OJ Made in America, 5 parts. Absolutely thrilling stuff. Stuff that you'll be thinking about. You'll be having conversations. I would probably advise to not watch this around children, even though there's only a couple of really gory parts in part 4 where they show the bodies. It's just some of these topics are too sophisticated for kids. I'm telling you this because I was a kid when this happened and I didn't get it. I had to grow up and learn about what was going on and learn and really do my homework to understand this whole story. It's way more than about O.J. Simpson. It really is about the racial divide in the West Coast, and it's a reflection of how the U.S. was as well. So check it out. that's my review. Rest in peace, Nicole and Ron Goldman. OJ Simpson's also no longer with us. You know, I do feel bad for his children. God knows what they're thinking, because just think about, you're a kid and you grow up thinking that your dad may have killed your mom. I don't know what they even think about it. It's their personal business, but just imagine if that was you, yo. That's a real tough situation. It's tough, man. Anyways, OJ Made in America. Check it out. See you in the next video.